and this is related to SQL Server. So please listen carefully. Customer may not separate the software for use in more than one operating system environment, which is a virtual machine or a physical machine, under a single license, even if the OSCs are on the same physical hardware system. Customers are not allowed to separate parts of the software under one license into different operating system environments. And what Microsoft defines as an OSC, operating system environment, is if it's a virtual machine or if it's a physical machine and there's an operating system, and everything inside that operating system is called an operating system environment. If you have a SQL Server license and you install SQL Server in a virtual machine and there's a database running, and then you decide, for various reasons, to install SQL Server integration services on a separate machine, you need a license for that integration services. You need a separate license. Let me draw this, by the way. Let me try this. You have an operating system, virtual machine, and there's a SQL Server DB. So you assign a license of SQL Server to this machine, and then one clever DBA decides, I'll just put SQL Server integration services, or SQL Server analysis services, or SQL Server reporting services, or master data services. And then during the review, during an audit, they say, oh, we only have, tools installed here. These are not SQL Server tools. Where you can find what you can install separately, we'll talk about it just in a few seconds. So what I'm trying to say here is, if you put it in a separate virtual machine or a physical machine, that machine, although you call it SQL Server tools, that machine requires an additional SQL Server license, even though the database is not running there. If there's an environment with thousands of SQL servers or hundreds of SQL servers, I bet there'll be other VMs there where there'll be integration services running, or analysis services, or reporting services running. And that's where a lot of audits fail. Almost every single audit, because people just don't realize that, yes, you are allowed to install SQL Server Management Studio on a separate computer, and you are allowed to install SQL Server tools on a separate computer. That doesn't require a license. But anything else which is not whitelisted, it must be whitelisted. Anything else that is not whitelisted requires an additional license. You're not allowed to separate the software for use in more than one OSC under a single license, which means you need a different license for that separate OSC. Because I promised to explain to you where you need to look for what is allowed to be separately installed, let's go back to the index and find SQL Server. These are the only components you may deploy in a separate virtual machine or physical machine that do not require an additional SQL Server license. As you can see, integration services, analysis services, reporting services is not a part of this. So the question was, as well as SIS, SSRS, SSAS, there are two SQL Server database engine products, DB Engine Services and DB Engine Shared. Do either or both of those need licensing if installed separately? There's another question I need to ask. What distribution did you use? What binary did you use to install it? If that was SQL Server Express, it doesn't require licenses. If that was SQL Server Enterprise, and it's not on that list I've just shown, then yes, it requires a separate license. If it's not on that list, it requires a separate license. It's simple as that. It's a white list. You don't have to guess. It's all there. Unless you downloaded them with a license that says you don't have to pay for it. It's sort of free. Look for limitations anyway. If they were installed from a commercial distribution package, they have to be licensed. They require a separate license. This was this caveat, unless expressly permitted by Microsoft. It is expressly permitted in that additional product section. And for every Microsoft product, if there are components that could be installed separately, there'll be an additional product section. If it's not there, then it's not expressly permitted, and then there's no way you can separate components without an additional license. It's not like you're not allowed to separate components. You can take it and just break it into various components and put them here, there, unless it's, by the way, sometimes it's expressly forbidden. Sometimes it is. And you just need an additional license. That's it. It's not like you cannot do this under one license, but under two licenses, yes, please. Under three licenses, by all means, just give us your money. because they can. And thanks for the question. I really appreciate the questions. It really makes it much more live.